So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and we make another sojourn into the old version of the game, hidden in amongst all of the new patch content that will have been splattered throughout the last couple of weeks, I suppose, for lack of a better term. But this is going to be another battle that I believe was sent to me by Tommy the Wise, and yes it was, or Tommy the Unwise, as he is now known in these replays it seems. But yes, this is, as you can see, a slightly edited version of Hobbiton, and one of the main problems that Hobbiton usually has is the fact that it is a very open siege map, and that is still going to be the case here. However, it's going to be a little bit more easy based on how this scenario is set up for the hobbits to actually defend their homeland on this occasion, because for a start they are not going to be surrounded on all sides as they usually are on this map. And they also have the added bonus of a few ambushes hitting the Arnorian petty kingdoms as they try to make their way towards the settlement in the first place. This does mean, of course, that the battle is going to be split into two very distinct halves, the ambush and the hobbit cavalry being the first thing to try and soften up the Arnorian advance before the overall defence of the settlement itself takes hold. I don't know if we're going to see any Arnorians try to march across the bridge. I would suggest probably not, given the somewhat spotty nature of bridges in Medieval 2 in general. The Arnorian encampment's just off the map in the distance there, and we will go through the Arnorians first and foremost, seeing as they are the attackers. So this is obviously not it's kind of a strange setup for a scenario. I don't know what situation would lead the Arnorians to attack the hobbits, of course, but you know, they have nice goods, I suppose, so trying to take direct ownership of that. Greed is a powerful motivator after all. And here we have average siege player who's going to be playing as Arthedain. Arthedain, of the two Arnorian petty kingdoms that are on the attack today, excuse me, probably better suited for fighting the hobbits. They have the armour to withstand the basic projectiles, but they also have a good amount of skill at the high end. A slightly more Dunedain focus of their army is going to stand them in good stead here. The upgraded Evendim spearmen, however, are going to be, I mean, they'll make a decent front line. You have to remember that the Hobbit infantry kind of does what it does based on attack bonuses and the fact that they can hide, and supporting units are very important for them, acting in combined arms, whereas the Arthedainians can rely on individual units to hold the line a little bit better. So even basic units of spears like this will be able to withstand a decent amount of punishment as long as it's not one of the higher end armor-piercing units that they have at their disposal. We also have some Arthedain men-at-arms here with the armour upgrades as well to make them just that little bit bulkier. Under normal circumstances, units like this tend to be a little bit underwhelming perhaps in this older version of Reforged. However, on this occasion I do think that the Arthedain men-at-arms will find themselves pretty at home, because of course the hobbits themselves are not going to be the best in terms of their ability to soak up pressure. So yeah, this is the kind of unit that even with their slightly lower ability to deal damage, they should do pretty well here. And of course the armour will help them withstand the barrage of projectiles that the hobbits are going to be laying down on them. Of course not the crossbow bolts, but most of the other things that the hobbits can throw at them. Those armour upgrades will be very useful. You can see here the Arthedain marksman with the breastplate armour upgrade as well, already going to be firing into the trees as the ambush has already revealed itself, as is the way it seems with pretty much all of the maps that Tommy has given me over the course of the last few months. The battle is going to get underway right from the start. There is no grace period whatsoever, so that's heartening to see. They are going to start shooting into the tree line. The Royal Court of House Armlaith, a unit which is slightly lesser seen because the Knights of Illuminus are just straight up better in every way. But of course in a scenario like this you don't get to choose your own compositions, and ultimately the Royal Court will still be very, very effective. If there are Bjornings on the defence, then they will be a bit of a problem, and the Sheriffs of the Farthings can be a bit of an annoying unit, but ultimately some hefty charges into the Hobbit ranks, the sorts of things which can do a lot of damage very, very quickly given the lower defensive abilities of the units they're going to be facing off against. We have here as well the upgraded Arthedain pikemen. Now, of course, the hobbits do have a unit of pikes of their own, but it's bound up in a crossbow unit first and foremost. So, in terms of blanketing the front line with pole arms, it should be the sort of thing where both of the Arnorian kingdoms here today should hold a bit of an edge over the forces from Cardolan. So 2 units of the pikes there. This is a unit which should do pretty well in this battle as well, the dismounted Fornost Arine Knights. Very strong unit of heavy swordsmen, of course, and this sort of base damage is going to be very, very useful against some of the squishier units that the hobbits will have to rely upon, which, I mean, most of the hobbit units are squishy, I suppose. We have 4 units of them as well, so that's a big amount of damage that could be coming their way. 2 units of dismounted knights for Numinous as well. Sword and board bodyguard units like this do have a tendency to be fairly... I mean, they're very, very tough, of course, but to be fair, the hobbits have the armor piercing to be able to deal with a unit like this. I think they'll be a little bit more concerned about Arthedain's more damage-focused units, but still, having a unit like this at the core of your army is, of course, going to give you a very hard centre indeed, especially when you have access to 2 of them. And, of course, we have the Wardens of the North here at the back. Armor piercing is not really the most important thing against the hobbits, it must be said, but the steel bows can still pick and choose their targets. Stuff like the Proudfoot Protectors will probably be the first port of call for them. But yes, Wardens of the North. Over here, we have Adin Men, who has also got Wardens of the North. I think this is going to be a very similar kind of army here at the back, with 2 dismounted knights for Numinous and some Wardens of the North, only instead of the dismounted Fornost Rhine Knights, it looks like they've got plenty of units of Dunedain Peacekeepers. They both will ultimately be pretty good at the same kinds of things. I think the main difference being the dismounted Fornost Knights do have a slightly better ability to deal damage, but the Dunedain Peacekeepers with their shields will have a bit more of an ability to absorb any sort of range pressure. This is the kind of foe that the Peacekeepers should be really, really good against. Lightly armoured units with not a lot of melee defense are going to be a good opportunity for them to clean up in terms of kills, though we'll see. We'll see. The hobbits do have plenty of tricks up their sleeves, I'm sure. A couple of units of pikemen. They also have some siege here in the shape of a trebuchet, so instead of a unit of cavalry, Adin Men has access to an artillery piece, and considering the open nature of Hobbiton, even in this guise, that's going to be a very useful force to have. A couple of units of Arthedain marksmen, and here at the front it's very much the same sort of thing, with several units of Arthedain men-at-arms, and then at the very front we have the Evendim spearmen. The other valley sees us get into the 2 Cardolan armies as part of the attackers, starting off with Tsunami, looking like the same sort of thing as well. Here at the front, the Minhiriath spearmen, who should actually be slightly stronger than the upgraded Evendim spearmen we've already seen. They are more a regular mid-tier spear after all, rather than a dressed-up militia spear. So, in terms of damage, it's not going to make too much of a difference, I suppose, so kind of the same sort of thing, ultimately. And then we have the Minhiriath men-at-arms in behind as well. They don't have access to any armour upgrades like the Arthedainians they're marching alongside, but the same sort of things do still apply. They should still be pretty solid at dealing with hobbits on the front line, and their shields, of course, will help them mitigate any sort of arrow fire, which they're going to have to do pretty quickly, I think, given the close proximity of the hobbits either side of them. A couple of units of them. We also have the trebuchet as well, already firing away, and the Minhiriath archers, so very much the same sort of setup here, with Minhiriath archers ready to fire on the ambush parties as they collapse in from the hills. Slightly different as we get into the upper end units, with the Wardens of Tir and Gorthad, a stronger unit of pikes most certainly than the Arthedain pikemen, and that's going to be a real problem for the hobbits, I would suggest. If the Wardens can really set up on the front line, it's the sort of thing which really will help them going into the latter stages. They do have crossbows of their own as well. The hobbits will be reliant on crossbows to a certain extent, I would imagine, if they are to go on to be victorious in this particular battle. But the Minhiriath sharpshooters, the armour piercing in melee, not so useful, but the sheer stopping power crossbows possess, still going to be very useful here. A couple of units of Dunedain captains. Obviously this is a more damage dealing unit, and I would suggest the hobbits will be slightly more scared of these than the dismounted Knights of Numinous, purely because of their heightened ability to deal damage. And at the very back though, a little bit different, more of a defensive unit more than the aggressive ones of the north, we have the Hearthguard of Amon Sul. Very capable of taking a lot of punishment, and they can be a bit of a slow burn in terms of their damage dealing capabilities, but we'll see. And finally, among the attackers, we have Winged Swordsman at 44, a couple of units of Spearmen at the front, several units once again of Minhiriath men-at-arms, pretty much the same sort of thing, although once again one army has access to artillery, but Winged Swordsman here has access to the cavalry. The Royal Court of House Thorondor, very, very similar to the Royal Court of House Amlaeth, though of course Cardolan don't have access to a unit of pure knights, so this is their best unit of cavalry, which we do tend to see a fair amount of when Cardolan are on the field. A couple of units of archers, 2 more units of the Wardens of Tir and Gorthad. Over here a stronger unit of crossbows as well in the Manatar Romen Gatekeepers, and at the back same sort of thing, a couple of units of Dunedain captains and a unit of Hearthguard of Amon Sul. Now then, for the de facto, well I say de facto, the actual defenders, we have the Hobbits. Hertumihai is going to be one of the ambushing forces. Farmers of Buckland, so this is a unit which is going to be very, very important. Their charge damage is very substantial. Very strong armour piercing on them as well, and armour piercing is something that the Hobbits are going to have to lean on very heavily if they are to win this, because in terms of baseline quality, both Arthedain and Cardolan should have the beating of them, so they're going to have to rely on range support and damage bonuses, and this sort of armour piercing that they have access to pretty much across their whole army is going to be very important. The battling Brandybucks are not quite as strong as the Farmers of Buckland, both in terms of base stats and in terms of their charge damage, but the armour piercing is still very much there and in effect. So several units of these armour-piercing shock troops are going to be charging down the hill very, very quickly. Even the Hobbitry in Arms here, the most basic of Hobbit units, does have access to that armour-piercing bonus damage. Individually, of course, they are still going to be struggling quite a lot, but all of those damage bonuses will, I would assume, add up, and it will make this a winnable battle for the Hobbits, but it's still going to be tough for them. Longbottom Mob, a unit of slingers, low base damage but still armour piercing, and ultimately they have those big wooden clubs in melee as well, which can be utilised to cave some heads in should the need arise, and I'm sure it will. In siege battles like this, everyone needs to do their part. Tookish Hunters are going to start firing away very quickly as well. Basic unit of archers, this base damage is mediocre at best, but there are enough of them, and their terrain is advantageous enough to the point where the attackers are going to take damage from both them and the slingers that we've seen already. Banderbrass archers are a little bit better in melee than the unit we've just spoken about, especially considering, once again, it's a unit that does have access to an armour-piercing melee attack, so that will be worth bearing in mind. Proudfoot Protectors going to be, I think, as they usually are, the most important unit to the Hobbits' attempts at winning, purely because the crossbows are so effective, and ultimately they are the only unit of pikes that the Hobbits can rely upon, and considering the amount of pikes the attackers have brought to bear today, you'd have to assume there's going to be some phalanx on phalanx combat at some point. Some Tookish Hunters here as well. I think on the other side of this there's also more of Hertumihai's force. Indeed there is. Tookish Hunters already firing away. Once again we've got the armour-piercing shock troops who are going to be the first ones into the fray. Things are going to start off pretty quickly here, you would suggest. Longbottom Mob, Banderbrass archers, same sort of thing here. Once again, and another unit of Proudfoot Protectors. As we make our way through the trees, we have the Womb Raider, who has got some Tookish Hunters as well. I'd imagine it's probably the same sort of thing. The Hobbit roster is not the most diverse thing in the world, after all. We have the Longbottom Mob, battling Brandybucks in the distance. There we also have Farmers of Buckland. All of these units are technically still hiding, though that won't last for too long. Of course, they'll want to make good use of this pincer-style ambush they have on both of the attacking columns. More Farmers of Buckland. And over on the other side here, we have more Farmers of Buckland, more Banderbrass archers, more Proudfoot Protectors. Plenty of crossbow bolts going to be hitting the attackers early here then. Battling Brandybucks, Longbottom Mob, that sort of thing. And moving out over here towards the settlement itself, we have Tommy himself, who is going to be using some Sheriffs of the Farthings as well to presumably slow the attacking advance and maybe try and pin the attackers there so the ambush can do more damage. And of course their projectiles, while not the best at dealing damage quickly, they will still be of concern to the attacking forces. A couple of units of Sheriffs of the Farthings, and in the distance there we have Ingemar, who also has 2 units of Sheriffs of the Farthings. As we make our way back into Hobbiton itself, over the bridge we have got some Hobbitry in Arms, we have got some Longbottom Mob. Like I said, not the most diverse roster in the world, so it's going to be mostly the same sort of things. Again, pretty much all of it does have that armour piercing they will be leaning on quite heavily, but the quality is in question, especially with units like Hobbitry in Arms. They can hold the line, but for how long against stuff like Dunedain? Tookish Hunters, we have more Proudfoot Protectors, very important as they always are. Battling Brandybucks behind the barricades, hastily assembled. Banderbrass archers, battling Brandybucks once more. And at the top of the hill here, this is going to be interesting as well. It's a lot of open ground for the attackers to cover, so the Gandalf's Fireworks, aka the Watcher, is going to actually be pretty effective, you would suggest. It's more a case of how much punishment the attackers can take at the hands of the defenders, supporting units here, and the Watcher has got plenty to work with given the wide open space in front of the settlement. And then over here, Ingemar's force, I imagine we're going to be seeing the same sort of thing. So yeah, Hobbits, Hobbitry in Arms, we've got the Farmers of Buckland, more Hobbitry in Arms, yeah, Longbottom Mob, all of that sort of thing, and another Gandalf's Firework Launcher. So it's going to be interesting this. I think that, you know, the Hobbits, as they always are kind of a difficult thing to quantify because of how variable their effectiveness can be based on how effective the players are at really delivering the bonus damages and all of the supporting units to the front line. If it comes down to a pure slugfest, you would suggest they would probably lose, but very interesting this. Hobbiton is not usually the easiest settlement to defend, and that's going to be the case here. It's still wide open in spite of its slightly more single directional focus in this version of it, but we'll see. Without further ado, let's get the show on the road. I think the only thing in question here is whether or not the cavalry that is part of the frontal defence of the settlement itself actually gets involved with this initial battle, because certainly the ambushes can do a lot of damage, but they will ultimately end in failure if the battle is to be isolated into two very distinct parts, as we are quite likely to see. Arthedain men-at-arms trying to retreat in the face of the withering projectile storm that we're already seeing, and the Royal Court of House Armor, they do have to charge uphill and through the trees in order to be able to get into a lot of these infantry units, and rather clumsily bumping into some battling brandy bucks as well, so it's not going to be the easiest thing to try and scour these trees in order to try and get rid of the hobbits here. I think actually they would be better off utilising their infantry more so than their cavalry, especially seeing as the cavalry would probably be better off going after the sheriffs of the farthings over here. So and the hobbits, the initial front lines are only going to last so long, and as soon as those ranged units start to become the main target for all of these slightly more professional units of infantry that the Arnorian kingdoms do have to work with, it's going to get a little bit more dicey for the hobbits. But again, just trying to do as much damage as humanly possible is going to be the name of the game here. Going after stuff like the Arthedain pikemen will certainly help their cause as well, otherwise late game when defending the actual village itself, that will be where things get a little bit more problematic for the hobbits. Dunedain peacekeepers should do really, really well, as we have mentioned in the composition phase, against forces like this. We shall see how many of them survive this initial assault. I mean, it is interesting that the Wardens of the North are already firing away as we make our way over to the other side of the hills as well. You can see Cardolan maybe dragging their heels a little bit more over on this side of things, but their infantry is now making it up the hill. Maybe a little bit of extra space actually will help the hobbits. As much time as possible to get as many missiles down range is going to be the primary thing here. And here we have men-at-arms moving up. Again, all of this armour piercing is all well and good, but it's going to be the overall level of quality which lets the hobbits down here. Not exactly renowned for their abilities as warriors. Though straight up martial might is not the only thing that they have up their sleeve. Sheriffs of the Farthings trying to do a few drive-bys on the Cardolan forces over here. A little bit more all-in from winged swordsmen over on this side of things, however. Again, battling brandy bucks, doing their best to hold on, but once again, pretty much all of the slopes that the attackers are having to try and counter-attack up, there is really just the one layer of infantry they need to deal with. It looks as though over here as well the cavalry has been manoeuvred into a slightly more useful position. The Royal Court of House Thorondor getting a nice downhill charge into the farmers of Buckland, and with the Dunedain captains in front as well, this is going to make very quick work of many of these hobbit units. Turkish hunters as well, trying to do their thing. Proudfoot protectors will be attempting to get as many crossbow bolts downrange as well. Also the kind of unit which the cavalry, it can charge into them, but there is obviously the very real risk there because of the fact that they are pike units in melee, that the cavalry will be dealt with very, very quickly. And you want to have at least some of your cavalry units left for later, I think. It may look very open, Hobbiton over in the background over there, but as we looked at through the map earlier, there are some things which constrict the map, but even still, there's more room than there would be on a standard siege map, and that means cavalry can still be useful into the late game for the attackers, so you don't want to just waste them. Nonetheless, these earlier stages are still where the cavalry is going to be a little bit more useful than later, I would suggest. Longbottom mob. So Cardolan doing pretty well over here. It took a little bit longer to get into the hobbits over on this side of things, and indeed it looks as though the hobbits are having a slightly better time of it over here as well, albeit Wardens of Tyr and Gorthar from Tsunami moving forwards. Also, the armour piercing doing its thing, but you can see that even here, where the hobbits are having some joy in some of the engagements, there's simply too many of the Arnorian infantry units to try and deal with. Over onto the other side. I mean, in theory, Arthedain should be a little bit better at dealing with the hobbits in melee at the very least, with some of their higher end units. Arthedain men-at-arms also have that extra layer of armour on them when they're armoured up like this. Arthedain men-at-arms doing reasonably well, not too much of the initial defenders remain. It's mainly going to be in stuff like Dunedain Peacekeepers, where the hobbits are really going to struggle. And this initial part of the battle does seem to be drawing to a close already. There is the trebuchet, which is also firing away, which is an interesting choice. I feel as though they're almost as likely to do as much damage themselves. Sheriffs of the Farthings routing off. Hobbitry in arms are shaken in spite of the fact they still have near 200 men in their unit. Such is the way of things when you're a relatively low morale faction. Defeat almost a certainty. Further up the hill, we do have not too much left. I mean, the dismounted Fornos Knights definitely would have been very effective, and pretty much all of the hobbits have been cleared from the higher ground over in the trees over here, and just having a look at the initial bits of damage done, while Arthedain have taken damage, you would suggest probably not enough from the Shire's perspective to have made this endeavour worthwhile. Sheriffs of the Farthings, 43 of them at the very least. As with most ranged cavalry units though, their charges are not going to be really impactful. Some of the Wound Raiders' force still alive. And over here on this side, Arthedain look to have completely dealt with this as well, and they could come to Cardolan's aid, and it is over on this other side of the hill where the hobbits were doing a little bit better. It's always a bit of a tragedy for defenders when you know that many of your missile units are still going to have ammunition left in the bank when all is said and done. I don't think there's really much they were ever going to be able to do about that, though. It was simply a case of trying to dump as much ammunition as possible. But still, crossbow bolts, throwing projectiles, arrows, all the sorts of things which will add up in the late game, and they will, I'm sure, wish they had when it comes to defending the main settlement. But this initial ambush phase is drawing to a close. Farmers of Buckland fighting downhill into the Wardens of Tir Gorthad. Only a fool could lose this battle. Band of Brass Archers. Well, the Hobbits, slightly better than you would expect abilities in melee may come into play here as well, although routing is also likely to be very much on the cards when you consider what kind of force they're going up against here. Some of Cardolan's units actually thinking of routing. A classic example of their morale being slightly less than what you would like, I'm sure. Defeat seems certain. The great irony. Meanwhile, still a little bit of resistance being put on by the hobbits over here. Cardolan making slightly harder work of things than their Arthedain brethren did in the other valley. But it's surely only a matter of time. I mean, there's some Tookish hunters still firing away. The Proudfoot Protectors are about to get completely enveloped by infantry. A little bit of a messy charge, but Proudfoot Protectors are wavering, and completely surrounded as they are, completely cut off from support. Cardolan's morale may be a subject for debate, but so too is the Shire's. As much as they can be kind of an awkward faction to face off against, they have very clearly defined weaknesses, and we are seeing some of those in action here, albeit slightly enforced based on the situation as it stands. Marcourt, House Thorondor, the Proudfoot Protectors do break. Again, around 50 units of Proudfoot Protectors routing off early. All of these are the sorts of things which will surely add up come the late game. I think that's pretty much it. And I think the attackers will be reasonably pleased with how this has gone. There's still a few units putting up resistance over here, and every Arnorian that falls out here is one that they will not have to deal with when defending the slopes of Hobbiton itself, but routing unit of Cardolan troops there? No. Proudfoot Protectors still fighting hard. Dunedain Captains. The ideal Hobbit killers, ironically enough, among the Cardolan roster. There is a very low-flying helicopter outside. Madness. The Band of Brass Archers are doing pretty well also. I mean, they are intended to have a little bit of extra bite in melee, and they do have more armour than most hobbits as well, with those chain shirts of theirs. You would still expect, I mean, especially considering that it is actually Arthedainian troops that have come across to give Cardolan a little bit of a hand. Routing units as well. On the other side, Arthedain starting to, well, there's a bit of fire at will going on there, but they are starting to form up what remains of their army over here, and they will then begin the march upon the Shire's capital. Moving forth. Band of Brass Archers still have a bit of ammunition as well, able to actually shoot a volley or two. Turkish Hunters not quite on the same level as the other Hobbit Archer in melee, but they've managed to last a lot longer actually as a result of this, and it's going to be Tsunami's Cardolan army that ends up paying the price for that, and the more that they can do this, the better chance they will have later on. Still a few units left over here, but the Dunedain Captains well and truly carving through those units there. The balance of forces is evenly matched. It is interesting as well to see some of those archers being used by Arnor. Would now really be the best time to use them? I mean, the open nature of Hobbiton itself means it's still really the ideal map for attacking archers to be used on the settlement itself, and over here you're actually fairly likely to get the odd instance of friendly fire. Finally starting to rout off what remains there. Further along, balance of forces is evenly matched still, which is, I mean, I suppose it's a testament to the bonus damage's effects on the Band of Brass Archers. They've managed to withstand an awful lot of punishment. There goes one of the Hobbit generals though. That's finally where the morale does fall apart. Timely manner as well. They'll need all the troops they can for pushing on to the settlement itself. And I think that's pretty much it. There are no more of the hobbits that remain, unless any of them have managed to return from routing, but for the most part, as we have a look over the field itself, I don't think there's any cavalry left either. Pretty much all of the examples on the minimap are units that are running. There's an awful lot of dead units over here as well, so is that archers that have done that? If it is, then I'd argue that's probably wasted ammunition. But still, it is more constricting than you would expect. I do wonder actually if you can go right the way around. I don't think so. I think this terrain is extreme enough to the point where it's intended that you cannot simply go around and send a few units right around the back. If you could, then cavalry would be ideal in this sort of situation. Undoubtedly as well, this little section of the battlefield is where we're going to see the firework launchers truly come into their own. Elsewhere, there are a couple of them, and they need to be used, I think, as soon as they possibly can. As soon as the attacking armies are in range, I think they should be opening up with those artillery crews. Any sort of advantage that the attackers have managed to mete out by dealing with those artillery crews will then surely be wiped out. Average siege player utilising his Arthedain marksman, but is that really necessary? Fire at will could prove to be a little bit of a mistake. I mean, so you have having a look at the armies as they reassemble themselves here. Maybe I wasn't giving the Shire enough credit. They have done a decent amount of damage, certainly to the point where the second half of the battle here is going to be competitive. I think the Trebuchet's got more range than the firework launchers. If that's the case, then maybe trying to snipe out the Hobbit artillery may be the way to go, as you would still not really back the Hobbit's chances. And the firework launcher is firing now in the distance as Cardolan begin their trek forward. Taking a little while to get going, but I mean, this would be the ideal thing to shoot into, this blob. Warns of Tirngorthad, Minotaur, Roman Gatekeepers, very worth getting rid of. much damage they can actually do, though. I mean, it is... You can see here how inaccurate these units can be, but a surprising amount of damage can be done nonetheless. Not a crippling amount to a single unit, but it's the sort of thing which can add up late game. The rest of the army lagging a little bit further behind. I mean, this maybe is a little bit of a concern for the attackers. They can't afford to be too disjointed. They dealt reasonably well with the ambush phase, but they need to have a good amount of synergy going into the later portion of this game. The other firework launcher from Tommy still not firing away. Arthedain pikemen. Arthedain do have plenty of their regular units still alive, and that could be really useful having these numbers. We've seen the forces of good lean a little bit more heavily on numbers, especially in the new patch of the game. And it has often been a real benefit to them. The firework launcher's still not firing, the other one falling silent for the time being. Main issue here may be the trebuchet moving forward. I'm sure that as soon as Tsunami's in range of that firework launcher, he will probably try to snipe it out. The increased range of the trebuchet. Ones of Tir Gorthad still in place as well. Look, Winged Swordsman's regular units are actually a little bit further away, but maybe that's because they were the ones further up the hill during the ambush phase. Sharpshooters, Hearthguard of Amon Sul, a very useful unit to have in the late game for outlasting much that the hobbits can throw at you. Arthedain getting a little bit closer now along the shores of the river. Arthedain marksman with the opportunity to start shooting into the hobbit positions, but so far not taking it, and indeed many of these hobbit units are hiding. That is, of course, we can see all the hobbit units because we're actually viewing from their perspective, but if you think about it, pretty much all of these units are hiding. Other than these battling Brandybucks over here, and the Gandalf's firework launcher, everything else is hiding, but you know as the attackers that there's going to be pretty much a full army lying in wait for you. More to the point, you know pretty much exactly where they're going to be, so it's a very unique kind of situation from that respect. Firework launcher wheeling itself a little bit closer. I mean, it's a very thin line. Probably the best way to counteract the Watcher, in all fairness, so fair play to Arthedain there. Peacekeepers rolling forwards as well. Not many of them left though. That initial ambush certainly did a number on them. Still slowly but surely the attacker's getting into position. The trebuchet is now firing. Is it going to try and counteract the firework launcher? Firework launcher should really be firing away actually, because that's a decent blob it can shoot into. Combination of Winged Swordsman and Tsunami's armies. Trebuchet actually decides not to fire now. You know, it's serious when the hobbits are building fortifications in their vegetable patches. That's the complete end of one of the ambush parties. Gandalf's firework launcher may have pushed itself too close to the action now. As a result, enemy archers are now in range. Question is, when are these artillery crews actually going to utilise their payloads? They don't have an infinite amount of time to do so. Dunedain Peacekeepers and Abingdon Spearmen forcing this unit of hobbitry in arms to reveal itself, and the first melee engagement for control of the settlement begins. Hobbitry in arms may need a little bit of extra support here. Such is their lower quality. Longbottom mob can provide that. Archers from across the river though as well. Arthedain marksmen. So the setup phase over. The attackers now making the attempt to start rolling these defences back. Is the lightweight nature of the hobbits going to be the thing which does them in here? Good position for the long bottom mob to be in. Still, they are taking things slowly here, the attackers. I mean, when you can't see huge swathes of the defending army, I suppose that is only natural. Still, the firework launcher not being used, even though all of these units are in range. This does represent the best opportunity for these artillery pieces to be utilised, and now we are actually seeing it. There's not really too many places further back on the map where you can retreat to either. You can use the hilly terrain in behind, but I don't know. So yeah, this, like I was saying, several of these projectiles will still miss, but this is still offering you the highest chance for hits. And this will also light a fire under the attackers. It will force them to move forward. That could be a blessing in disguise for the attackers, but they clearly want to take things a little bit slower, have a more considered approach. Maybe being forced to move forward more quickly will, however, only bring about the hobbits' destruction just that little bit more quickly. Arthedain men-at-arms trying to do business against the hobbits now as well. Making our way back across. They don't have to deal with any sort of river crossings, Cardolan, but they do have a lot of fortifications still to have to try and pick their way through. Firework launcher is so close to this line of stakes that I feel as though the rockets won't actually clear them. That would be a massive misstep as well. I do feel as though the artillery is very key to, if the Shire wish to go on to win this fight overall. Hobbitry and arms revealed by the Minhiriath already wavering as well. You need to be careful as Cardolan. Sending forward exploratory parties like that of units you don't mind losing just means you may end up having them crippled very, very quickly. And you can see here that unsupported, already damaged and battle-weary units of man-at-arms may very well waver and break in the face of even the most basic hobbit units. An embarrassing fate, to be sure. Further back. Plenty of support there. Trebuchets have actually been abandoned by the looks of it. Yeah, and the Minhiriath end up routing. A little bit of a misstep there, perhaps. Trying to get away with being a little bit too stingy. Cardolan don't have limitless manpower anymore. The ambushes have, technically speaking, done their jobs. They need to be a little bit more all-encompassing than this. They need to be a little bit more willing to send forward something a little bit more serious, and Arthedain clearly are, because the dismounted Knights of Illuminus are moving forward with the expectation of brushing aside this unit of hobbitry and arms, and more reinforcements already on the way as well. All of the lines being tested to a greater or lesser extent, though over here as well. Already depleted Arthedain men-at-arms shaken up. The hobbit reinforcements are closer after all. Still going for this more careful and considered approach, Arthedain, but as much as they are known for having better morale than Cardolan, it's by no means limitless in their most basic units, and many of them are shaken on the front line. Once again, in the face of the most basic hobbit infantry. Long bottom mob. That support proving to be fairly important. Evendim spearmen still waiting. Still the small matter of the firework launcher as well, which, I mean, that can definitely have an impact on morale, though you can't really utilise it on the units just in front of them. You're going to do just as much damage to your own units. Wavering now as well. They need reinforcements on the front line here, Arthedain. Further along. Throwing projectiles being used. I mean, as much as the dismounted Knights of Illuminus are strong, defeat seems certain for them at this point. I feel like that's more than just the long bottom mob doing that. I feel like there's probably, yeah, it's got to be the Proudfoot protectors as well. Crossbow bolts, cutting them down to size pretty quickly, and the attackers starting to look a little bit fraudulent here. Situation could get away from them if they're not careful. They need to start making some real progress. They need to, I think, stop being so stingy on the front line with the units that they're committing. Send forward something a little bit more serious, a little bit more heavyweight, and really start testing these lighter Hobbit troops. Still, Hobbitry in arms, time and time again we're seeing across the battlefield at this point, Hobbitry in arms with victory seems certain, writ large above their heads. Even over here, although I imagine that's probably going to switch around pretty quickly with the Hearthguard and the Wardens of Tir Gorthad on their side. Arms of Buckland with that armour piercing, but again, maybe the terrain. Brownfoot Protectors. All of them pretty much in good positions, and we are seeing the power of the crossbows here, even if it's fairly difficult to keep track of where these bolts are actually going. Early on, the ambush parties may not have been able to utilise all their ammunition, but that is not a problem that the defenders of Hobbiton themselves are having. This, though, maybe is the only way of going about things now. Bit of a Hail Mary from Cardolan trying to send forward an overwhelming force. As I said, this it doesn't come without risk, because this is a huge blob now which can be taken advantage of. Although this is a little bit of a risk from the Hobbits as well. You're going to do just as much damage to your own men. Impetuous, some of the Hobbits there. I mean, you are routing off Cardolan quicker than you're routing off your own units, but you need to be very careful with that sort of thing. You can see over here now as well, the Hobbit lines starting to buckle a little bit under the pressure. So Cardolan, with their own crossbows as well, maybe this is where the attackers can start to claw their way back into contention. Are we going to see a similar sort of thing over on the other side? The initial defence on the bridge seems to be bowing a little bit as well, so maybe Arthedain are also following suit. Although once again we're seeing yet more routing from more depleted units. Victory seems certain for the Arthedain pikemen. These infantry lines are starting to look a little bit fragile, with a unit crossing over from this side as well. They're able to surround elements of the Hobbit front line. Looking elsewhere, Evandim's spearman facing off against Tookish hunters, managing to push a little bit further into the defensive line. I mean, Tookish hunters shouldn't really be all that good in melee, but then heavily depleted militia spears are not exactly the last word in terms of damage dealing either. Fornoster Rhine Knights getting shot up by the Banderbrass archers on the way forwards. Don't know if the rocket launchers have expended their ammunition. Still trying to get as much of this ammunition into Arnorian bodies as the way forward for the Hobbits. Again, I don't know if they're necessarily going to be able to use up every last bit of their ammo here. But the goal has to be to use as much of it as possible. The Proudfoot Protectors probably need to draw their pikes, otherwise they are going to get torn apart by the dismounted Knights of Anumnus, the other unit, which avenging their brethren, which have already been completely demolished by the Proudfoots. Having a look on the other side of the battle, the Cardolan front. Their crossbows are almost certainly having a bit of an impact here as well. Mutually assured destruction in this older version of the game, and indeed I think in any version of Medieval 2, just based on how the baseline mechanics work, crossbows are always going to be really, really effective in this kind of situation. Cardolan among the Western Kingdoms embracing that weapon type more than most others. Further back, I mean, do Cardolan have the manpower to be able to carry this forward? However, it doesn't look like it. They may well have dealt with the initial front lines that Ingamar had laid on, but I don't know if that's going to continue to be the case. The Trebuchet remounting, some Banderbrass archers actually from the Womb Raid are going to be able to interrupt their firing. I don't know, I mean, Banderbrass archers are probably stronger in melee than the Trebuchet crew, so they may not be able to remount, especially when you consider the front line is really looking quite fragile at this stage. Hearthguard of Amon Sul still stand pretty strong in the middle of all of this, however. Not too surprising to see the Longbottom mob try and focus them down. Still the small matter of the Royal Court of House Thorondor as well. If they can get past these initial fortifications, there's plenty of room for them to manoeuvre in and charge down many of these hobbits, but there's not really much of the Cardolan army left for them to act in support of at this stage. Further along, let's see how Arthedain are getting on. Dismounted Knights of Illuminus doing very well. I mean, I think Arthedain have got more left in reserve infantry-wise than their Cardolan brethren over on the other side, and that's going to be to their great benefit. Maybe the Royal Court of House Thorondor should be acting in support of Arthedain more so than anything else. Dismounted Knights being the Proudfoot Protectors doing their best, but they're not really in the best defensive position for pikes at this stage. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. Heavy swordsmen carving through what remains of the Hobbit artillery crew. Turkish hunters, still plenty of them, but not the unit that you would choose to have an abundance of late on if you had a choice about it from the Hobbits battling Brandybucks. Facing off against Wardens of the North, again, the quality discrepancy between those two units is fairly extreme. Dismounted Four Norse Knights. There goes one of the attacking generals, one of the Cardolan ones as well, so that could be the beginning of the end for Cardolan. Their morale has already proven to be fairly suspect in this fight. Panzer forces evenly matched. Further across, I mean, the fact that the Hobbits still have units in reserve, still have units that are able to utilise some ammunition, the Trebuchet firing away and actually getting what looked to be a fairly direct hit there on a fairly healthy unit of hobbitry and arms, so even if Cardolan do go down, they will go down swinging, and that will give their allies in Arthedain on the other side of the field the best possible chance to go on to win this. Pushing towards the town centre by the looks of things. Some units, I don't know if that's an active town centre though, it's got the Aztec banners, so I have a hard time believing that is actually the case. Many of these completely custom maps don't actually have a town centre. I think that may be just an aesthetic one. Hiriath sharpshooters. Gonna try and finish off the Gandalf's fireworks crew. Over here, Manatar Roman Gatekeepers facing off against Proudfoots, two units of crossbows which have a polearm in melee, but the pikes will be able to outrange the halberds here. So you would actually back the Hobbit unit, especially seeing as they seem to be in slightly better condition. There goes the other Cardolan general. Surely that marks where Cardolan will really start to fall. Only 3 Royal Court of House Thorondor remain, though they will get their lances down. Burrowing into that unit of Longbottom mob. And Hiriath sharpshooters fleeing. Still a few units in reserve here from the Hobbits. Are they going to try and regroup? Is Tommy's army going to try and regroup with Ingamar's to meet the challenge of Arthedain as it arrives? Arthedain able to be victorious over on this side of things, where Cardolan on the other side were not. Just having a look at the kind of qualities that Arthedain have left, however. Good amount of Wardens of the North, good amount of dismounted Knights of Illuminus, even their regular troops, stuff like pikes in the late game. How many missiles do the Hobbits still have left to be able to deal with that sort of threat? I'm not sure. Fairly similar, however, in terms of how you would perceive the armies from afar. As I said, I think the overall level of quality, you would probably back Arthedain. If you're reliant on stuff like Turkish hunters en masse, not really sure that's going to be the answer. Cardolan still with their cavalry trying to soften the enemy up as much as possible before their allies arrive to try and bring about victory. Of course, terrain should favour the Hobbits. You can get up onto the high ground and hope that that will be enough, although, oof, that was a good and fortuitous hit there. Band of Brass Archers. Cardolan still Trying to twist the knife as much as possible ahead of Arthedain's arrival. Still, only 2 of the Royal Court of House Thorondor still remain, but when you're charging into units as lightweight as this, you're still going to do a decent amount of damage per charge. Hobbitry and arms in high numbers as well. Maybe these numbers are the key. Do Cardolan have any infantry units left to speak of? Doesn't look like it. Interestingly enough, it does look as though these Proudfoot Protectors and Battling Brandybucks will finish off what remains of the Cardolan infantry. The Gatekeepers will be finished. I don't know if these Hobbit units will be able to retreat to the same position that the rest of their army is in, however, and they may need a unit like the Proudfoot Protectors if they are to go on to be victorious here. Uphill. They should be able to. I mean, there's Royal Court of House Thorondor that may get in the way, but I mean, they're pike units at the end of the day. It would be a suicidal effort from Winged Swordsman's final 2 riders if they were to try and charge in then. You never know. Saving those cavalry units is probably the wiser thing to do if you can get a charge late on when both armies are very tired and very depleted. It still may be enough to cause a rout even with only 2 cavalrymen remaining. Arthedain trying to deny a complete terrain advantage to their foes. Trying to fight on a singular trajectory. It will turn into a de facto field battle actually if this does become the case, though the hobbits would be within their rights, I suppose, to retreat just a little bit further onto that hill just behind them. And it would be up to the attackers to move forward. The onus is always on the attackers to move forward, unless otherwise specified. Wardens of the North. Have any ammunition left in those, do you reckon? Very high-end projectiles. Does the Cardolan Trebuchet still have ammunition? I'm going to assume no. Still 7 Vanderbrass archers over here, which could get in the way of the trebuchet still being further used in this battle. They have managed to get those Proudfoot Protectors back into defensive shape as well. Pretty much the centre point of their defensive effort it's going to be. They even managed to save the firework crew. As sadly useless as they may be as a melee unit, everyone is going to need to try and do their part on the front line here. Competitive, this battle, though. It's always quite difficult to balance a battle like this where you have very distinct phases between ambushes and standard sieges and ultimately what's going to be a fairly even kilter de facto field battle here at the end, and yet things are still finely balanced. Vanderbrass archers hidden, and this is going to be one of the things which the hobbits can do. They can simply have their units in hiding for the most part, and even if Arthedain do have skirmishers that they can still use, they will need to go close enough to reveal the hobbits anyway. Trebuchet still rolling forwards. What have we here? Minotaur Roman Gatekeepers actually still alive, remarkably enough. The Royal Court of House Thorondor, this is a pretty severe climb for horses to be at full gallop on. Gatekeepers. Vanderbrass archers now moving backwards as Arthedain maybe showing a little bit more intent to move forwards now. In terms of sheer numbers, the hobbits clearly have more, but in terms of the actual quality, when you're talking about dismounted Knights of Illuminus, when you're talking about Wardens of the North, there's also Arthedain marksmen still with a bit of ammunition as well. The trebuchet getting a nice hit there into the long bottom mob. albeit they are hidden, or were hidden, so it's more by accident than by design. But yeah, I think sheer aggression is going to serve the attackers best here. Try and really lean on that quality that you still have. If you stay at arm's length too long, stuff like the Hobbit archers, which still have ammunition, are going to make you pay for that. There goes a Hobbit general. Again, those Cardolan riders. They'd been damaged for quite a long time in this battle, but that was a surgical strike there from House Thorondor's knights. Wavering some of these units. Average siege player and add-in men may be slightly out of sync with one another, not attacking fully as one. As a result, some routing starting to be engendered in the Arthedainian ranks. That will be a concern. That is something we've noted as well in this battle overall. Cardolan and Arthedain, maybe less surprising in the former's case, but more so in the latter's, have been more partial to routing here than the Hobbits. And that could yet prove to be the biggest difference maker of all in this battle. Smelted Fornos Knights. Those artillery shots skimming the tops of these hills. Forward come the dismounted Fornos Knights. Their presence will be greatly appreciated on the front line, I'm sure. Banderbrass archers trying to get in behind enemy lines. Interesting that the trebuchet is trying to shoot at them. Still over 100 of them, and they've already shown their abilities in melee in this battle already. 8 Arthedain men-at-arms trying to stop them, but that will be a highly temporary measure. Dismounted Knights of Illuminus, maybe again just dragging their heels a little bit too much. Needed to be a little bit more unified, this, I think, from an attacking perspective. Their quality may yet still be enough to see the attackers over the line. I don't know. Victory seems certain. There's still, again, they've got several Knights of Illuminus still on the field. Surely the Hobbits don't have the quality to face down a unit like this consistently. Further back. Longbottom mob being chased by Warns of the North. 34 Warns of the North. They're exactly the sort of unit which the Hobbits probably don't have it in them to face off against. Exactly the kind of base damage and melee defense that should be too much for them to bear. Still the artillery raining down as well. There's always the hope for the Hobbits that they actually miss the Cardolan artillery crew and hit too many of their own men. There goes the final Hobbit general. That may very well be the beginning of the end. We may start to see a little bit more of an example of the Hobbits' lower morale, although the swarm is still very much alive. Much of it made up of the Banderbrass archers now as well, one of the slightly stronger units that the Hobbits have to offer in melee in a situation like this. Banderbrass archers, though, shaken. Several of these more healthy units are routing as well. If not for the routing, maybe the Hobbits would still be feeling very confident, but they certainly can't afford for Proudfoot protectors to rout off. But when faced with Wardens of the North, they may be sorely tempted to do so. Well, there goes an Arthedain general as well, and we've already seen that their morale is somewhat less than perfect so far. Trying to utilise flaming shots to bring about final victory here. Technically speaking, less kills inflicted upon the Hobbits. They're effectively 3% ahead, but it's what those percentages are made out of, and also routing units don't technically count as units killed, I believe. So there's still quite a lot of units just sort of running around like headless chickens. That may prove to be a big difference maker indeed, but maybe. We've seen time and time again in this sort of situation the quality actually come through for one side or the other, but maybe on this occasion it's actually the numbers of the hobbits that will prove to be too much for the Arnorian invaders to bear, especially with the returning 100 hobbitry in arms. When a unit of that size returns this late on, it can be a big difference maker. Arthedain marksman actually stabilises the hobbitry in arms arrive. I don't know for how much longer, and indeed they don't, they rout, but it's always amusing when you see units go from wavering to shaken when a unit charges into them. Very peculiar. Dismounted Knights for Luminous are not taking a huge amount of damage, but neither are they working their way through the hobbitry in arms really that quickly enough for it to be truly effective. Proud for Protectors proving to be solid as well, and yeah, with all of this that's left, the hobbits, as it seems, are going to be victorious. The numbers in the end enough. I thought for sure with 2 units of Dismounted Knights, the Wardens of the North, good quality, I thought that would be enough, but on this occasion it wasn't. The armour piercing, Banderbrass Archers proving to be, I think, probably the MVPs on this battle, with the range damage and how surprisingly effective they've been in melee as well. I think you would have to give it to them. There you have it. It's just going to be clean-up at this point, really. Trebuchet crew will probably admit defeat, considering how far away they are. Close battle this one, though. Finely contested. Credit has to go to Tommy as well, because battles like this, as I mentioned, kind of, when they have multiple distinct phases, they are a little bit more difficult to balance. There was certainly nothing wrong with this one in that regard. Either side could certainly have gone on to win. Trebuchet crew is actually at the top of the hill now, but surely, with Arthedain completely gone. The great irony, of course, is that Cardolan, in spite of being the subject of bullying a little bit more so than Arthedain, by virtue of that Trebuchet crew, they will probably outlast their Arthedainian kin. I think. Well, maybe not. They did just rout. Arthedain with 1 Warden of the North and 1 Dismounted Knight, actually 11 Dismounted Knights scattered, will be able to outlast. I do like the Wardens of the North. Probably one of my favourite units stylistically. Great choice of weaponry. Run through by a wooden stick with a spike on the end of it, however. Dismounted Knights of Luminous, one of the few units from Vanilla that remains unchanged even to this day, but then when you look at how good a job they did on them initially, that's not too surprising. And that's it. All that remains of the hobbits are here. All of the hobbits' fine goods remain in their own possession, and the Arnorian invasion fails. Obviously not a lore-friendly battle this by any means, but still an interesting one, and it does go to show how awkward the hobbits can be to face. I think they are better suited than most as an ambush faction, and that initial phase of the battle I thought wouldn't go as well for them as it did. I thought because they only really had 1 line of infantry per side that the Arnorians had to try and deal with and face, that the lower level of survivability and quality would make them pay in the end, but they still did a decent amount of damage early on, and that did snowball into the late game where the 2 hobbit defending armies, there were clear moments where they were starting to be driven back, but ultimately, thanks to a combination of routing and just outright armour piercing damage that the hobbits were inflicting, they weren't able to make that really stick, and while eventually the hobbits had to retreat to the hilltop, it was on relatively even footing, rather than a situation where the Arnorians were crippling the hobbit defences bit by bit and forcing them back on their terms. In the end, the hobbits were able to do so a little bit more comfortably, and with their numbers they were just about able to see themselves over the line in spite of their own shortcomings as a faction that the hobbits clearly have, but still, the awkward faction that they are. And also they managed to accomplish this without the Bjornings and the Great Eagles and the Ents, which are 3 very heavy hitters that the hobbits are very well known for having in their stable. Let's see what did the damage for them though. Sheriffs of the Farthings, we didn't really see them in action too much. The ambush was a fairly frantic kind of affair, but still that's not a terrible amount of... well, actually no, that's really poor. I was looking at casualties healed, but no. Casualties inflicted, yeah, that's not great. Gandalf's fireworks did okay, not as effective as we've seen that kind of artillery piece be in the past, but there was a limited window in which they could be utilised, and in all fairness to the attackers, the wide formations they took up were pretty good at counteracting how effective that unit could have been. Proudfoots, as kind of expected, they were always going to be pretty effective in this situation. Crossbows always are in siege battles where the attackers have no choice but to march into them. Banderbrass Archers, like I said, probably the MVPs as far as a unit goes for the Hobbits. Tookish Hunters doing okay. Banderbrass Archers once again breaking 100, and I imagine that's going to be something repeated. Not too many melee units breaking 100, I would suggest. Farmers of Buckland doing so, battling Brandybuck, so the armour-piercing one's doing pretty well there, but once again the ranged units being the true stars of the show. Sheriffs of the Farthings in this army doing a little bit better. Over here, battling Brandybucks once again, Tookish Hunters. We've got Banderbrass Archers not breaking 100 here, but still 299 on one of them. And then finally, plenty of units breaking 100 over here, my word. And this, I think, was one of the ambushing parties as well, so that goes to show that the damage they did in melee was perhaps far more severe than I was initially giving the Hobbits credit for, and it looked as though Arnor were having a pretty decent time of beating back the ambushes first off, but maybe that was not the case. It's difficult to keep track of things when things are going so quickly, but yeah, I guess it does go to show that bonus damage can be a really big force multiplier, and for the Hobbits that is very, very apt against forces that rely on their armours, such as Arthedain and Cardolan, to a certain extent anyway. Maybe not with their upper tier Dunedain, but certainly with their rank and file, and that was what a fair amount of their army was made up of today. So yeah, big thank you to Tommy for sending yet another custom battle in. Obviously it's a changed version of Hobbiton, and it's one that the defenders can clearly more easily defend. The classic version of Hobbiton, while it is maybe a little bit more detailed as a map, is notoriously difficult to try and get a win on as the defenders, because it's so completely open. You get very limited advantages really, other than terrain, that allows you to try and be victorious, and time again we see the defenders try and fail to defend that map, but on this occasion, on this version of Hobbiton, they were successful at defending their home and their goods, so no longer will they have to pay tribute to their Arnorian overlords. Big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. The next one up is going to be a battle replay, the first battle replay that was created, or the first map I should say, that was created by the Womb Raider, albeit we should have already seen one of his maps on the new patch. That was one he sent me second, but it got more priority because it was on the test build, whereas this one is on this older version of the game. So we will be seeing another one of those, and it's another Arnorian focused one, though it's a far more lore friendly battle replay, a cityscape siege, so that's what we're going to be seeing next up. There should also be a few Silmarillion replays coming up as well from a recent update that was done from them, or at least it was recent as of a month ago, but such is the way of my horrendous recording schedule that I'm going to have to try and make do with that. But yes, there should be some fairly substantial Silmarillion battles. There will of course be other things from the new patch and Reforged in general, and we march ever closer to the general release of the new patch, and as soon as that happens, of course, we can start doing faction overviews once again, and we can come full circle with the channel a little bit, really return to my roots and go back to doing what my channel was all about in its very earliest days. But yeah, other than that, not really anything else to report. Like I keep saying, do keep an eye on the community tab for any sort of updates that I may post, because it may be that quickly I need to start making a channel update video to inform people on maybe a little bit of a change of schedule, which may have to happen in terms of like upload days and all of that jazz, but we'll see. Again, it's one of those things that we'll just have to play by ear. Big thanks to all the players here once again. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.